Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining ILS in this brand new series called The Influential Muslim. I am your host, Abdul Hai. This is the second presentation in this series. For those who are new to ILS, we are a small project that aims to bring back reading experience to the life of the Muslim, especially the younger generation. We do this by a number of means, among them uh, writing book reviews, having book club, conversation with the author, presentation like the one that we are doing today, inshallah. Today's presentation is on the life and the works of Allama Iqbal, rahimahullah, delivered by Professor Irfanullah Farooqi, who completed his PhD in sociology in Universalism to Muslim Nationalism, a sociological inquiry into the evolution of Muhammad Iqbal thought. Farooqi is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the South Asia University, India. Prior to joining the South Asia University, he worked at the Department of Sociology in Aligarh University and other leading institutions. His areas of interest includes Islam and Muslim in South Asia, Urdu study, South Asia social thought, sociology of literature, sociology of education, and as of now, he is interested in university, nation, interface, academic freedom, secular religious exchange, media, cultural dynamic, and questions related to identity. Professor Irfanullah, ILS is honored to have you present on the life and work of Allama Iqbal. So I'll give it back to you, inshallah.
Okay, Jazakallah. Thank you very much, Abdul Hai Saab. Am I audible? Is my voice?
Yes, yes.
Okay, excellent. Great. So thank you for having me, and I sincerely hope that I'm able to do justice to the theme. So I just want to, before I begin, I want to kind of put on record a set of disclaimers. One is that I'm not going to talk about, I will not really dwell too much into Iqbal's philosophical ideas because I think that's something that requires more deliberation and more investment. In any case, in about 45 minutes or 40 minutes, I really don't know how can one possibly put together life and works of Iqbal and his thought. So needless to say, it will be exceedingly abbreviated reflection. So my apologies for that in advance. The other thing is that my understanding of Persian is not even elementary. So I'm not going to borrow from his Persian works as much as I should have. Of course, there are translations, and I have kind of benefited myself from translations of pretty much all of his Persian works. But in this particular talk, in this particular presentation, I will restrict myself to his Urdu works. And more specifically, I am operating in the light of his letters, something that has been quite surprisingly overlooked by scholarship on modern South Asia. So it's quite surprising that nobody actually till date, and I say this with utmost conviction, that nobody has really categorically worked on Iqbal's letters. And when you read his letters from start to finish, and he wrote quite, quite, it's a huge number. So these are 4 huge volumes. A lot of stuff that I kind of talk about in the context of his thoughts is to be traced back to his letters. So I just want to kind of put this on record before I go ahead. And so with these words, let me just quickly take the plunge. So as I said, let me just, yeah. So we know the theme for today's discussion, interaction, exchange, which is Iqbal, life and works. So I'll just quickly, in about 2 to 3 minutes, I'll quickly share with you how did I, end up working on Iqbal. Now, as we all know, and I'm sure this is no news to anyone here, that very often we think that the intellectual journey is kind of an isolated, compartmentalized journey, but that is seldom the case. The intellectual is always complemented by the personal, and there is a peculiar way in which the personal and the intellectual come together. So I was, of course, no exception. When I finished my MPhil on Faiz Ahmed Faiz, an iconic progressive writer from the subcontinent, I was actually thinking about possible themes to pursue my PhD, and Iqbal was someone who kind of remained with me uh, till then, because of my father's literary background and a certain atmosphere in which I was raised. So there was so in my life, I had kind of been exposed to Iqbal's writings, predominantly Urdu poetry and a little bit of Persian poetry. So Iqbal was with me by the time I finished my MPhil, and he remained a very unusual poet because whenever Iqbal was talked about, he wasn't talked about just the way other poets were talked about. So, for instance, we know of other great poets from the subcontinent, for instance, Ghalib, for instance, Hali. Of course, Hali is not to be treated as a great poet, but nonetheless a significant figure. For instance, Mir Taqi Mir, Momin Kha Momin, Da Dehlvi, and there is no end to this list. But whenever Iqbal was invoked in a very different way. And again, not necessarily as a student of sociology, but more importantly, someone who was kind of attentive to the nuances of literature, culture, and so on. I could not overlook this extra, or not extra recognition, but let's say the reverence that was around Iqbal in the day-to-day discourse. So this was something that stayed with me, and as a result, I thought I should just give it a shot. I have 5 years of doctoral research, so might as well take the plunge and figure out how can we make sense of this reverence that is there in the subcontinent. And I can say this definitely for India. I can't really speak on behalf of friends from Pakistan, but I'm sure in Pakistan, the legend is essentially informed by something else, something that I can perhaps comment upon a bit later. So there was a blend of academic and personal reasons. And it so happened that I decided to kind of work on Iqbal. So primarily, I was interested in looking at the unusual reception of Iqbal, something that I found very provocative. That why on earth can't Iqbal be also treated just like another great poet, and why this extraordinary marked respect and admiration and reverence that is around Iqbal. And in addition to that, of course, by the time I had started doing my PhD, thanks to a series of developments in the subcontinent, I had kind of become interested in broad thematics such as Islam and Muslims in South Asia, or let's say intellectual traditions in modern South Asia, the interface, literature, politics interface, because I had already worked on foreign affairs, and particularly also the ways in which the Indian intellectuals were responding to questions pertaining to modernity. So these were things that were in the background, and Iqbal kind of fits very well into this broad thematic. So I ended up deciding to work on Iqbal. And of course, those 5 years were extraordinarily illuminating because I ended up reading quite a bit of work on Iqbal, by Iqbal, that otherwise I don't think I would have ever read. So this is briefly how I kind of chanced upon, not necessarily chanced upon, but how I kind of entered into the world of Iqbal. And of course, I haven't come out of it. But if one were to only think about the doctoral research, I of course came out of it way more informed and rooted in the subcontinental literary tradition. Uh, all right, so just a brief biographical sketch. This is simply keeping in mind that some of our friends present here might not be aware of the ins and outs of Iqbal's biography. So broadly speaking, 1877 to 1938, that's the time frame we are engaging with. Born in Sialkot, then initially educated in Sialkot. This is where he gets associated with one of the most iconic scholars of Persian and Arabic in the subcontinent, Sayyid Mir Hassan. And of course, Iqbal remains indebted to Mir Hassan's teachings for the rest of his poetic, philosophical, academic, literary career. Got married to Karim Bibi in 1895 when he's 18 years old. 1895 he goes to Lahore, does his BA in philosophy, then his MA in philosophy, BA in philosophy and English, MA in philosophy. 1899 he's done with his MA. By the time he finishes MA, he has already established himself as as kind of an emerging poet. So he's not really that old, but in the literary circles of Lahore, already people are talking about the genius of Iqbal as this, budding poet who's showing incredible promise when it comes to his literary imagination and poetic craft. During his stay in Lahore, another important thing that happens is that he meets Thomas Arnold, Professor Thomas Arnold, who was his teacher. And Iqbal, of course, fell in love with, in many ways, Thomas Arnold because of his extraordinary scholarship and the sheer accommodation with which Arnold met his students. And of course, Arnold also fell for Iqbal because Iqbal was no ordinary student. So this was another important development while he was in Lahore, his meeting with Professor Thomas Arnold, who would remain quite instrumental in Iqbal's subsequent intellectual journey and careers. From 1899 to 1903, he teaches Arabic at the Oriental College, Lahore. Following that, he leaves for Cambridge in 1905, and again, Arnold played a very important role in Iqbal's going to Cambridge to Europe. Obtains his BA in 1906 at Trinity College, and from there, he applies for, he's called for the barristership, and he is qualified as a barrister the same year. And in 1908, 2 years from 1906, he is defending his PhD at University of Munich. So 3 years in Europe, and he ends up obtaining 3 degrees, so BA and LLB or law, which was at that point of time, and a PhD in philosophy at University of Munich. And of course, his PhD thesis, The Development of Metaphysics in Persia, is cited as a fairly important intervention. 1908, while he was, and this is an important passing reference, while he was in England, uh, scholars have pointed out that in a certain way, his political affiliation had begun, not actively, but kind of on paper. So 1908, the British faction of Indian Muslim League appointed him as the member of the Executive Council. So this is 1908. Before he leaves Europe for India, he's already officially part of the British faction, the British branch of the Indian Muslim League. So this is just a passing reference. Of course, he would become more actively involved in the subcontinent politics 1926 onwards, but 1908, this has happened. Now, 1908, he returns. After 3 years, he returns to India. He starts teaching philosophy at Government College, Lahore, and he teaches for about 2, 3 years. But of course, teaching is something that he's not able to manage because he's also practicing law, 2 years later. But eventually, what happens is he quits teaching and he gets into full time practicing as an advocate. Gets married to Sardar Begum in 1910, second wife, but only nikah has happened. The rukhsati has not taken place. Sardar Begum stays at her native place. And then 1911, he starts his practice as a lawyer, marries Mukhtar Begum in 1913. This is when he has already separated from his first wife. And then following this, of course, intellectually, Iqbal acquires a certain prominence. So he spearheads an intellectual movement against territorial nationalism and endorses, is almost an ambassador of pan-Islamism in the subcontinent for a while. Remains totally dissociated from the Khilafat movement. This is also something very interesting, and we can come back to this, that how Iqbal, on the one hand, is someone who advocates pan-Islamism. In fact, this is part of the common sense of South Asian scholarship, that Iqbal and pan-Islamism go together. But when pan-Islamism is kind of expressing itself in the most forceful way in the subcontinent, 1919 onwards, all the way till 1925, Iqbal is surprisingly silent. He's not associated with the movement at all. In fact, he has some very nasty things to say about the movement. So this is an interesting puzzle that one might want to look into as students of history. November 1920, another interesting thing, Gandhi, the iconic leader, Gandhi writes to Iqbal to become the vice chancellor of what was then called the Muslim National University, which is now the Jamia Millia Islamia. The university was essentially a movement, a result of a movement, which is the Khilafat movement, the anti-colonial agitation. But Iqbal quite gracefully refuses, and he excuses himself, and he has a set of reasons to offer. But cut the long story short, Iqbal refuses to serve as the vice chancellor. So had he accepted, he would have been the first vice chancellor of Jamia. But anyways, he excused himself. Then he's knighted in January 1923, and this led to a lot of issues because, of course, a lot of people who admired Iqbal could not believe that Iqbal ended up accepting this knighthood. But nonetheless, this happened in January 1923, and it kind of ruffled quite a few feathers in the subcontinent. 1926, elected to the Punjab Legislative Assembly, something that officially marks his career as a politician or beginning of his political career. 1930, he delivers the infamous address in Allahabad as the president of the All India Muslim League, December 1930, in which he kind of suggests an autonomous Muslim homeland. And of course, a lot of scholarship in South Asia, mistakenly so, attributes the idea of Pakistan to Iqbal's 1913 Allahabad address. Attended the roundtable conferences in 1931 and 32, the second and the third roundtable conference, wherein, of course, he's representing the Muslims of the subcontinent. And after, of course, there are other things as well, but just to kind of make it as abbreviated as possible, he falls ill in 1936 onwards. He's extremely unwell. In fact, the last 1 year of his life, we are told by biographers that Iqbal was hardly able to speak because of a severe throat infection. 21st of April 1938, Iqbal breathed his last. So that's, broadly speaking, the biography. Let me just quickly also, again, not going to talk about it, but one can just to get an idea of the kind of canvas and the sheer, potential of the man we're talking about. So many works of Persian poetry collections. So Asrar Khudi, Rumuz Khudi, Payam Zabur Ajam, Javed Nama, which is considered as quite an extraordinary sort of composition. Pas Bayat Kar Aqwam Sharq, and then Armaghan Hijaz. So these are Armaghan Hijaz is a combination of Persian and Urdu, but here I've kind of placed it in Persian works. And then the next one, collections of Urdu. So it's quite interesting that Iqbal is usually talked about as an Urdu poet. But of course, if one were to go by the facts of his works, then his Persian works quite significantly outweigh his Urdu works. So one can very well say that maybe his Persian collection is three-fourths of his overall poetic corpus. So in Urdu, he has written not that much, but of course, extraordinary stuff that we have here. Bange Dara, which is Call of the Marching Bell, Bale Jibril, 1935, and Zarb Kalim. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. It's ZARB and not ZARM. My apologies for that. The Rod of Moses, 1936, shortly before, 2 years before Iqbal's death. Now, with this, it is just to kind of make sense of where he's placed, and very quickly, his prose works, important ones. A book that he wrote on economics while he was teaching at Lahore, before going to Europe, Ilmul Iqtisad, which is the science of the subject of economics. Then, of course, his PhD thesis, I recently referred to the development of metaphysics in Persia, that came out in 1908, and the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, and absolutely a work of peerless philosophical theological studentship that came out in 1930, a collection of six lectures that Iqbal delivered in Hyderabad, in Aligarh, and there's another lecture that he delivered in London. So the 1934 address, sorry, the 1934 edition essentially has the London addresses, 7 lectures in total. So this is broadly what we have when it comes to Iqbal's works. Now, of course, in addition to these, Iqbal he delivered many speeches, he's delivered many lectures, and that's a different collection altogether. So just to get an idea that this is what the man is up to. Now, let me, in the time, let me just quickly, I believe there's someone who's not on mute and it's constantly, the sound is a bit distracting. But anyways, so very quickly, the remainder of the presentation is committed to some of the core insights into Iqbal's thoughts. So what I'll do is, just important points vis-a-vis Iqbal's poetic thought and philosophy. So this is what I'll do in the next 20-25 minutes. And with that, we can finish this and then maybe get into questions and answers. The first thing, the reason why Iqbal is to be talked about, and I think the reason why he merits special attention, is to do with the fact that his grasp over history is over not just history, but philosophy, literature, politics, mysticism, you name it, theology, linguistics, and so forth, was so strong and so deep that he was not just another poet. He turned out to be an uncommonly gifted poet. And what Iqbal also does is that he takes poetry away from this very dominant narrative around poetry, which was well established in the subcontinent in the early 20th century, that poetry is a spontaneous feeling of one's inner self. Now, if you read Iqbal's poetry, you would realize that one thing that is for sure is that it is not spontaneous. It is remarkably analytical, it is meditative, And there is so much that Iqbal invests. There's such an extraordinary cognitive labor that goes into Iqbal's poetic reflection. So he kind of, I think he's the first one in many ways who kind of takes this whole idea of poetry as to do with the realm of felt. He kind of does the decoupling poetry and feeling, and he brings in a poetry which, of course, invokes a certain sentiment. It completely gets you carried away, but it is not just a matter of felt, or it is not just sentimental stuff, but it is a result of a remarkable, uncommon uh, rigor that is invested. So that is point number one. Now, of course, there are many literary critics who've pointed out that poetry is never about the felt. Poetry is something that happens as a result of serious endeavor. Which word goes where, what kind of rhyme, what kind of a flow we'll adhere to. So there's a, for the lack of a better word, there's a science of poetry. But this is something that in Iqbal's poetic reflections, this comes out very clearly. So one could perhaps consider Iqbal as someone who kind of, turns the entire discourse. And with Iqbal's entry in the subcontinental literary tradition, you kind of see a very different kind of, poetic reflection coming out. And I'm particularly talking about the Urdu poetic reflections. I'm not a scholar who can comment on his reflections in Persian. Secondly, Iqbal's exemplary awareness of his audience. This is another thing that I want to talk about. That Iqbal was not someone who was just writing for the heck of it. Iqbal was someone who, at a very early age, was well aware of his audience. In fact, if you go back to his biography and you look at how he kind of shot to fame, so there was this conference that he was a part of, Anjuman Himayat-e-Islam. So this was an association for the assistance or cooperation vis-a-vis Islam's whatever development, advancement. And every year they used to have this mushaira, this gathering, the poetic gathering. And Iqbal would, in many ways, work throughout the year for that event. And he would recite a poem that would just, he would steal the show, as it were. And these were poems that were meant to invoke a specific sentiment out of the audience. So Iqbal was never someone who was just writing poetry because he had nothing else to do. For him, poetry, from a very early age, poetry was an important means of connecting with people. And the idea of there being a message in the poem is something that goes back to his early years. So exemplary awareness of his audience that accounted for his distinction as a poet. And as I maintain, he was not just a poet, he was essentially a performer. So whenever he would go to mushairas, he wouldn't really recite some of his not so extraordinary poems, but in fact he would craft his poems to the extent that there was just no one else who could match his poetic genius. So he was, in my opinion, he was a performer and not just a poet. So that's that. Then Iqbal is also to be considered as a new chapter in subcontinental Urdu poetry, because he is someone who kind of again shifts the priorities of literature and poetry. So before Iqbal, not to say that one is not making a very generic comment, but predominantly this was the case, that poets were poets because they had a certain association with imagination, with ideas, with rhyme, with a certain flow, and so on. So poetry was for the sake of poetry, or art was for the sake of art. But what happens in the case of Iqbal is that, of course, art remains extraordinary. The quality of Iqbal's poetics is not at all compromised. It is throughout first rate. But what his poems essentially convey is something very different. So, as many scholars have pointed out, that we see a shift from art for art's sake to art for life's sake, right? Art for life. This is something that we see in Iqbal, and he kind of turns the discourse, or let's say he brings in, or he writes a new chapter, or one could say that he serves as a preface to something that is to happen 3 decades later in the subcontinent, which is the progressive movement, where iconic writers they're making a case for art for politics. So there are scholars who have looked at how Iqbal is someone who facilitates the coming in of the progressive movement in the subcontinent. Following this, Iqbal's unmistakable middle class location, I'm sorry, and the bearing it had on his day to day life and his politics. Now, again, very often when we talk of Iqbal as someone who was beyond class, caste, and identity locations. But the fact of the matter is, and this is something that we will learn if we read his letters, that Iqbal was as middle class as many of us. I can't really comment on everyone present here, but I'm assuming that it is a predominantly middle class setting. And when we talk about middle class, one of the things that we are talking about is that there is always a certain anxiety vis-a-vis the future. And the middle class in sociology is also defined as an aspirational class. And Iqbal was no different. Uh, and the reason why I want to very briefly talk about this is that if you think about the contradictions in Iqbal's poetic thought, if you think about the fact that on the one hand he's talking about issues with imperialism, but at the same time he is not at all writing anything against imperialism, or he is. So, for instance, what happened once was, uh, there was a person who wrote in a magazine article, he wrote about Iqbal's communist leanings. And of course, in many of Iqbal's poetry, you can find a certain leaning towards the classical Marxian formulation vis a vis alienation, vis a vis deprivation, exploitation, and so on. And so there was this magazine article, and this was, I think, in the 1920s. I don't exactly remember the year, but Iqbal got to know about it, and he immediately wrote to the editor of the magazine, and he asked him. He did not request him. He asked him to kind of take down the article and issue the statement on behalf of Iqbal, where Iqbal categorically writes that he is somebody who is absolutely anti-communism. Now, of course, on the face of it, it seems like a typical Islamic position, which might as well be the case. But there are scholars who point out that it is not just to do with Iqbal's Islamic location. It's also to do with Iqbal's concern as a typical middle class individual in the 1920s, 30s India. Because if the colonial government goes against him, and we don't have to be made aware of the fact that the British always had a certain principled distance from communism as a philosophy, as an ideology. So if we think about that, then it becomes again very clear that it was the typical middle class self of Iqbal that kind of did not want to take chances, right? The other thing that is also important is that in many of his letters, he's writing to different chief ministers of provinces, and particularly the chief minister of Hyderabad, and he wants a scholarship for himself. He's somebody who is just like many of us, who's not interested in working, and he would want a sponsor, a scholarship, so that he could, just be at ease and get 500. And his demand is just 500 rupees a month. And he keeps writing to this chief minister of to Nizam, the Nizam of Hyderabad. But of course, that doesn't happen. And he's, of course, after a point, he's annoyed. So you again see the contradiction. On the one hand, Iqbal talks about self, Khudi, the independent self, the creative genius of the self. But in his day to day life, you see that Iqbal is horrendously dependent on patronage networks. And once again, if you want to make sense of this contradiction, all you need to do is just figure out the fact that, or, engage with the fact that Iqbal is inescapably, hopelessly middle class. And therefore, his concerns, his concerns are no different as compared to our concerns in the 21st century, irrespective of our national locations, provided we come from the middle class. So his unmistakable middle class location and the bearing it had on his day to day life and his politics. So Iqbal's politics cannot be understood without engaging with, as earnestly as possible, his middle classness or his middle class location. A revolutionary understanding of the human being, backed by meditative reading of human agency in the face of destiny. This is another important, and again, I'm sure some of us who have read Iqbal, they don't need to be informed. I'm sure they're already aware of it. That in Iqbal's poetry, it is basically it is it is a reflection that celebrates the human being. Of course, scholars write that celebrates man, but because we live in a world which is more gender sensitive, so I would use human being instead of man. So it celebrates the human being, the centrality of human being in the entire scheme of creation. And it is here that Iqbal also presents extraordinary reflections vis-a-vis the interface of human agency and destiny. So, as Muslims, we believe in destiny, and in fact, we are not Muslims in true sense of the phrase, in true sense of the term. If we do not believe in destiny, it is part of our belief. It is part of what we call iman mufassal. But then Iqbal is someone who, while on the one hand does not, of course, he cannot, as a Muslim scholar, thinker, he cannot dismiss the primacy of destiny, but he talks about the importance of human agency in the face of destiny. That how destiny is, of course, not to be disturbed, and destiny is sacrosanct, but at the same time, it will be highly unfortunate if one were to kind of seek recourse to a certain kind of fatalism. So there is an interesting reflection in terms of human self, the creative human self, in the face of all odds. So even if it appears that destiny is not really in your favor, you're not supposed to kind of give up on action. So there is primacy of deed and action in many of his reflections. And then following this, and this is something that you might find interesting, that in many of his letters, Iqbal categorically insists that he's not a poet. In fact, he expresses frustration about the fact that he is treated as a poet. He's considered a poet. And he just, in fact, in one of his letters to Sayyid Suleiman Nadvi, he writes that I have absolutely no idea why the hell people consider me a poet. I've got nothing to do with poetry. Now, this comes across, anyone who's reading a letter of this sort is immediately unsettled, because who else is Iqbal if not a poet? An extraordinary poet, a poet par excellence. And nobody can talk about poetics in South Asia without referring to Iqbal. I think it's impossible to talk about literary traditions of South Asia without referring to Iqbal. And yet, here you have his letters where he categorically points out that he's not a poet. Now, several literary critics have written on this. For instance, one prominent literary critic, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, who's unfortunately not alive anymore, he died in December 2020. He has something interesting to say about it. I don't endorse it, but I'll share it with you. So Shamsur Rahman Farooqi writes that Iqbal was writing all this because of his humility, because of his modesty. Now, I don't agree with it, because Iqbal was, in, as it turns out, in many of his letters and reflections, he was not really someone who was markedly humble and modest. He always took pride in a lot of things that he was. So I don't, of course, Shamsur Rahman Saab, Marhum, of course, is a titan, but I disagree with him. I have something else to say in relation to this statement or this position that Iqbal has, that he's not a poet. So simply put, if you think about the late 19th century, early 20th century South Asia, and you think about the predominant ways in which literary endeavor, or let's say creative, literary creative pursuits are looked at, poets are basically not looked at as social engineers. So basically, poetry is not to do with social engineering. Poetry is not to do with reform, as far as the dominant understanding is concerned. In the 1930s, of course, with progressive movement, things change, but we are talking about the 1910s, 1920s. And it is still at this point of time as well, poets are simply supposed to deal with poetry, and that's about it. And if you are treated as a poet, then there is a strong likelihood that your message is kind of taken lightly. Uh, uh, so it is taken lightly, and it is something. So you will not be able to extract the kind of seriousness that you merit, that you deserve. And Iqbal was aware of this, and it is because of this reason that Iqbal did not want to be counted as one of the poets of the age. Because if he was to be treated as a poet, then the message that he had for the Muslims of the subcontinent, or let's say the nation in general, uh, that message would have kind of, fallen flat. And therefore, this insistence that I'm not a poet, I'm not to be treated as a poet, and I have nothing to do with poetry. Of course, he was writing extraordinary poetry as he wrote all this, but he did not want to be treated as a poet, because deep down he knew that if he were to be treated only as a poet, then this extraordinary message that he was trying to convey through his poetic compositions would essentially be would not be treated as as much with the kind of earnestness and deliberation that it merited. So this is another thing that I want to. And just to now towards the end, his scathing critique of territorial nationalism and how that brings in an Islamicized poetic aesthetics in his post 1908 poetry. Again, something that's very important is that Iqbal, as soon as he lands in Europe, so 1905 onwards, Iqbal begins to think about territorial nationalism. And this is the time, those of us who are aware of the genealogy of the nation state, and particularly the modern nation state, around the time of the First World War, would know very well that it was in the late 19th, early 20th century that nation is an idea which is territorially bound, and the concept of sovereignty is something that acquires a certain currency in the late 19th, early 20th century. So when Iqbal is there, he kind of becomes aware, not to say that he wasn't aware of it earlier, but I think in Europe it was a more intimate, it was a more first hand encounter. And it is because of this that he begins to think very seriously about the crisis in the Muslim world. And he arrives at this conclusion that the villain of the age, or the most consequential evil of the times, is territorial nationalism. So 1906 onwards, he begins to write against territorial nationalism. And it is around this time that Iqbal also switches to Persian. And what is interesting is that not just Persian, but also a certain kind of Islamicized poetics that one can see. So basically, he's working on two fronts. One, he switches to Persian because for him, and this is something that he has written about as well, Persian is, even at that point of time, the lingua franca of the Muslim world. So he's writing in a language that is assuring him of a communication with not just Muslims of the subcontinent, but Muslims across the globe. That's his position. So, in fact, while he's in Europe, he writes very little in Urdu. For the most part, he is writing in Persian. Very few compositions in Urdu. For the most part, he is writing in Persian. And of course, right after coming back, he's majorly invested in Persian. So that is point number one, Persian being the lingua franca, and therefore, in a certain sense, transcending the borders of nation state, going beyond the dominant discourse of nationalism, territorial nationalism. The other thing is that he brings in Islam as a core theme in his poetry. And Islam, according to Iqbal, is the antidote. Islam is the is the strongest possible response to this evil, the villain, territorial nationalism. So, in much of his poetry, after his return from Europe, you will find uh, the 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 presence of Islam. So there are two prominent compositions. So one is, of course, Khizr, which came out in 1922. Of course, there are many, but I've just so if you read this, may the Muslims unite in watching over the shrine from the banks of the Nile to the deserts of Kashgar. Whoever practices discrimination in color and blood will be erased, whether he be a tent dwelling Turk or an Arab of noble family. If race takes precedence over the religion of the Muslim, you have flown from the world like the dust of the highway, so that the foundation of the caliphate may be once again firm in the world. Search for and bring from somewhere the heart and spirit of your ancestors. So you can see the kind of, the anti-territorial kind of sentiment that is so clearly there. And then Tulu Islam, which is also a very important composition. This is the destiny of nature. This is the secret of Islam. Worldwide brotherhood and abundance of love. Break the idols of color and blood and become lost in the community. Let neither Turanians, Iranians, nor Afghan remain. So this is very much, this is very much in relation to what we have uh, in the context of Iqbal's poetic reflection. Now, my apologies, but I just have two more points to make. In fact, my youngest son, he kind of deleted the last slide from the PPT. I apologize on his behalf. Two things that I want to, and I won't take more than 3 minutes maybe, and then we can, close this. So the other thing that I also wanted to talk about is Iqbal's take on Muslims. And Iqbal kind of, again, if you read his letters, and this is to be found in many of his poetic compositions as well, that Iqbal kind of had this complaint vis-a-vis the Muslims. And the prime argument that Iqbal has is that Indian Muslims or the subcontinent Muslims have kind of drifted away from Arab Islam. And he points out that there is the Iranian influence that is to be considered as the root cause of all problem. And when he talks about Iranian influence, he's basically talking about the influence of a certain kind of mysticism and how this mysticism was constantly distancing the Muslims of the subcontinent from action, from deed, from a certain kind of agency driven life. So this is one. And some of us might be aware of his critique of the extraordinary poet Hafiz Shiraz, the legendary uh, poet from Shiraz, Hafiz. Iqbal is not happy with Hafiz. Of course, as a poet, Iqbal cannot get out of the spell, but he's not happy with Hafiz because Hafiz's poetry, according to Iqbal, creates a certain kind of numbness. It distances one from action. It brings in a certain kind of idleness, a certain kind of static existence. Or, in fact, let's say it glorifies a static, idle existence. So that is one point in relation to generally Muslims, that how the Iranian influence is something that has really corrupted us, and we need to go back to the Arab Islam, the Islam of activism, the Islam of agency, and the Islam of a certain kind of an assertive individual, the assertive Muslim individual. Secondly, Iqbal on the ulama. And this is also a very important point because I think, generally speaking, people misuse Iqbal very often when they talk about Iqbal and ulama, but that's a different discussion altogether. Iqbal, of course, had serious grievances against the ulama fraternity of South Asia because Iqbal believed that the ulama actually lacked the desirable sense of duty. This is something that Iqbal categorically believed in, and in many of his letters, he has expressed his concern that the ulama they do not possess the required sense of duty. Now, what is the farz that they have to comply with? So, what is the sense of duty? The sense of duty is to do with the fact that they must read modern texts, they must acquaint themselves with European classics, and then they should be able to respond to the concerns that are raised by modernity, something that Iqbal thought that ulama are not doing. Now, again, there were few people from the ulama camp that Iqbal had high reverence for. For instance, Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi. Iqbal, of course, admired him to no end. There was another great, iconic alim from Deoband, Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, rahmatullah alayh, and Iqbal, praised him to no end. And when Iqbal spoke about these figures, he of course he knew that these people have the potential, and he also knew that if your understanding of Islam is really as deep as the moment demands, then you will be able to respond to the crisis that modernity has brought about. So, for instance, in the case of Allama Shah Kashmiri, Iqbal knew it for a fact that Allama's understanding of Islam is so remarkable, and his study of Islamic texts is so deep and so analytical that he doesn't really have to read the European texts. Just on the basis of this solid, fearless reading, he can very well confront modernity head on. So this was his take on the ulama. And just to end in relation to Jinnah, this is also something very interesting. A lot of people talk about Iqbal Jinnah relationship has to do with the vision and reality. Now, if you read letters that Iqbal has written to Jinnah, so there are, I think in total, there are 19 letters. And let us be very clear that Iqbal did not like Jinnah in the beginning. In fact, Iqbal, for the lack of a better word, he hated Jinnah. In fact, he calls Nehru that there's no difference between you and Jinnah. You are a patriot, he's a politician. So Iqbal had a very different understanding of the politicians in the 1920s. So he did not like Jinnah one bit. But of course, the situation in the subcontinent changed, and Jinnah rose as this iconic leader by the mid 1930s. And Iqbal starts writing to him. So if you read the letters very, very briefly, if you read the letters from start to finish, 19 letters, the first thing that you notice is that in the beginning, Iqbal is dictating the terms. He's speaking as this assertive Muslim intellectual who's almost commanding Jinnah to do something. But then as you move from letter 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, 6, and then towards the end, you see that Iqbal has become this docile, ardent follower of Jinnah. So if you read letter 1, you see such an assertion with so much confidence. He's dictating terms. And in the last letter, Iqbal kind of presents himself as the humble servant of Jinnah. So this also tells us about the change, the shifts that were taking place in the subcontinental politics, and how Iqbal kind of was never really out of that. He was very much determined by these broader currents of politics in the subcontinent. So the letters that are exchanged, of course, Jinnah did not respond to many of his letters. Uh, I think about 5, 6 letters he responded to. Jinnah was busy in his own work and his own mobilization. But Iqbal, of course, kept writing to Jinnah, and in the end, he of course considers Jinnah as the leader that the Muslims have been waiting for, which is again a very interesting thing to think about, given Jinnah's day-to-day life and Jinnah's overall association with Islam, and how we understand Iqbal as someone who's pivotal in terms of Islam as the central force of social change, of social engineering, and so on. So there are other things as well that could be talked about, but I think I've already taken my time. My apologies if I've gone beyond the allotted time. But thank you very much for your attention, for your patience, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jazakumullah, Professor Farooqi, for this presentation. Is certainly eye-opening. Um, everyone, those who wants to ask questions, inshallah, more than welcome to either ask the professor directly or you can write it down. I'll read it out to the professor. I have a number of questions. I'm a big at the outset. I'm a big fan of Allama Iqbal. I have 2 of his biography. I have a number of his work, and it certainly his poetry is something that excites me a lot. Having said that, two question. With regards to his poem, the famous one where he goes into trouble with the more traditional ulama, the class, the shikwa. When he wrote the shikwa, the question is how was the response from say Darul Deban and other ulama that consider themselves to be the patron of Orthodox Islam? How did they respond, and what was Iqbal respond when they accused him? Because I know a few places they accused him of being a murtad, or at least having some almost like anti-Islamic attitude. So that's my first question, and I'll say both of them so that you can. And the second question is, when he wrote his Jawab al-Shikwa and he read it out and he collected money to send it to the Ottoman, the Khalifa, to support them. Now, how is that possible that he was in one hand against the Khalifa movement and other hand he's kind of supporting to establish the Khalifa? And answers too, but the last point is that was Iqbal trying to combine a create a West stroke East Islam whereby he's able to live his true life? You said that he was a Muslim activist, a pan-Islamist, at the same time accepted the knighthood. So was he trying to make a sense of himself that there is a possibility of combining the both? I can be the West and the East at the same time. So that's my 3 question, and yeah.
Should I just respond to these and then maybe take other questions?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. Thank you for these questions. I think these are very important questions. I'm sorry, I should have actually referred to Shikwa, because Shikwa is a very important moment in the 20th century subcontinental literary tradition. So when Iqbal writes Shikwa, and again, we get a lot of insight through his letters, because my interest has been that what was he writing about? What was he writing in his letters while some of these compositions came to the fore? So, of course, Shikwa kind of created a lot of anger in the subcontinent, because, and there are scholars who point out that Iqbal already had Jawab-e-Shikwa in mind, and then he wrote Shikwa first and then wrote Jawab-e-Shikwa, right? So he knew that, the sequel, so it's like the sequel is already there, but just to make sense of the sequel, you write part 1. And in one of his letters, if I remember correctly, if memory serves me right, and this is an exchange with Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi, who's of course a great scholar. Now, Nadwi, of course, does not have any issue with Iqbal's Shikwa. And I think Nadwi is also somebody who can make a distinction between what we call scholarly, literary, or scholarly and poetic. There were few ulama who did not really bother because for them it was poetry, right? And why bother? It is not really a pamphlet, it's not really a proper maqala, it's not really a dissertation. So some of them kind of did not really pay attention to it because it was a poetic composition and a wonderful poetic composition. And there is something called what we call poetic license or artistic license. And Iqbal was making use of that. But Iqbal writes to Nadwi that people need to give it some time. And in due course, people will understand what is the, not just the literary merit, of course, that's a different thing, but what is the overall, let's say, civilizational legacy of Shikwa. That we will never have something of the sort that we have in Shikwa ever again. So this was never done before, and in all likelihood, nobody can ever do anything of that sort later. So the response, so predominantly, of course, the ulama were against it, and this is what made Iqbal even angrier because he figured it out that the ulama are kind of completely deprived of that of that, let's say, of that understanding, that they're very hasty in many ways, that they're very tentative and superficial in their reading. But there were people who did not respond, point number one, and there were people who understood its literary merit and did not question it. In relation to Jawab Shikwa, and this is an important point that you make, that on the one hand, Iqbal kind of tries to help the Ottoman Caliphate, and on the other hand, he stays away almost as a matter of principle from the Khilafat movement. This is precisely what I was pointing out, perhaps indirectly, that Iqbal always had a certain position in terms of the caliphate. It is not to say that he did not uh, he did not agree with the idea of the caliphate. He was very much, in fact, his very famous, Fatima bint something. I don't remember the title of the poem, where he has kind of, in a very sentimental way, he has reflected on Libya's downfall and what kind of repercussions it has. Just to come back to this, so Iqbal, I think it is not really a contradiction as much as it is a matter of perspective. So what, and this is again something that we get to know from his letters, that he does not agree with the with the predominant way in which the Khilafat movement was going forward. In fact, there is also a letter of his where he says, and this is kind of, it makes it very sectarian, but he says that I don't really agree with a movement that is dictated by the whims of several Shias who are based in London. Right. So now again, you can see the kind. So it is, and in the beginning, by the way, he was associated with the Provincial Khilafat Committee. For several months he was there, but then he immediately distanced himself. And then after that, he does not write a thing. In fact, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar, who was, of course, he was in the front row, he was leading the movement from the front. Muhammad Ali Jauhar was in jail when Iqbal was knighted. And Muhammad Ali Jauhar wrote a scathing critique of Muhammad Iqbal, saying that, we were the ones who read Asrar Khudi and Rumuz Khudi, and we would weep for hours because of the kind of intense poetic genius. And here we are in the in behind the bars, and Iqbal is being knighted. And Muhammad Ali could not come out of that shock because it actually came as a shock that while the who's who of the Muslim community are actually rotting in the jail, and Iqbal is knighted. And there is, of course, a fantastic composition that is also written where, a person is kind of just ripped apart Iqbal, that, from Allama, he has become Sir, that degeneration in his. And then lastly, I don't know whether he was trying to combine the two, because I think when it comes to Iqbal, he's very clear that the East has a certain superiority. He does talk about both strands as important, but if he was to take, and I think this was the time when a lot of people were doing this, whether it was Tagore or Iqbal or Anand Kumaraswamy, all these folks who were writing about Eastern and Western, who were operating with this lens, they always talked about Eastern wisdom with a certain sense of superiority as compared to Western knowledge, right? So they all, but at the same time, they all believe that it is important to be aware of the tenets of Western knowledge and not just simply harp on or talk about or blow the trumpet of Eastern wisdom. But I believe that Iqbal primarily considered himself as someone who was rooted in the Eastern traditions, but he had no qualms in accepting that he was exceptionally well versed with the ins and outs of the Western tradition. So I don't know when he accepted the knighthood, whether he was thinking about all this. I think it was a moment of, I don't know what exactly happened at that point of time, but I'm sure retrospectively, Iqbal would have sort of not receiving the knighthood, because the kind of reaction it generated, way more than shikwa, by the way. Shikwa was just restricted to the Muslim community, the ulama, but here I think pretty much across the subcontinent, the leaders, people in general, were way more disappointed than what was the case in relation to shikwa.
We got two question. Iqbal.
So I have the question in the chat.
Okay, all right,
So I'll
sure.
thank you. I think it's not just one question. It's a couple of quite a few questions. So first of all, Iqbal was of course very much influenced by Rumi. In fact, there are many occasions in his poetic reflections where you can see Iqbal as a certain kind of as someone who inherits a great deal from Rumi. Now, of course, Rumi's poetry is also, pretty much like Hafiz. Rumi's poetry is also about a certain kind of pacifism, and Rumi is, of course, a mystic of a very different sort. But Iqbal, I don't know, for his own reasons, he considers Rumi way ahead of Hafiz. I'll stop there. But definitely, Iqbal is very much influenced by Rumi. In fact, there are many statements of his where he's talked about how much he owes to the likes of Rumi, Ghalib, Goethe, and several other European philosophers. To Goethe, I think Iqbal was someone, and this is an important point. I think the reason why Iqbal would refer to some of these scholars or icons who were not talked about is because Iqbal wanted to present a case for what we call world literature. And this is something that we only find in Iqbal. Before Iqbal, that is not something to be found. It is only in Tagore's writings later that we find a case for world literature. So, for instance, just to very quickly point out a very important reference, when Iqbal writes on Ghalib, so when he is leaving for England and he is in Delhi for a couple of days, he visits Ghalib's grave and he writes an extraordinary poem while he's there. So, in that poem, towards the end, you will see a connection that Iqbal draws between Ghalib and Goethe. And he says that here you are buried in this desolated Delhi, and in the gardens of Weimar, you have your peer, you have your rival, as it were, not rival but peer actually. So he was drawing a connection between Ghalib and Goethe, something that is not done before. And in order to draw that connection, you have to be aware of Goethe's contribution, Goethe's writings. So it turns out that before he had left for England, he was already aware of the German tradition, literary tradition. So I suppose he did borrow from Goethe. And in fact, one of his Persian works, Payam-e-Mashriq, which is Message from the East, is actually a response to Goethe's Divan of the East. So Payam-e-Mashriq is a response to Goethe. And Iqbal was, of course, he also learned a bit of German, whatever he could in 3 months. But in 3 months, he had learned quite a bit of German. In fact, we are told he defended his thesis in German, we are told, so which is quite a remarkable thing. Uh, he specifically wrote poetry on the theme Lenin at the Court of God. Yeah. So can you explain further? So basically, again, this is so Iqbal was somebody, and I stand corrected. This is my submission. Iqbal was someone who did not want to leave any major political current untouched. So, for instance, if Marxism is kind of acquiring a certain prominence, Iqbal will also engage with Marxism. And what he would then do is he would kind of, he would approximate things in a typical Islamic vocab. And that's, I think, his poetic genius. So he would actually bring Lenin into a setting that we don't associate Lenin with. Lenin in front of God is a very unusual kind of an imagery, but it's a fantastic imagery to think about how Iqbal does it. So what my submission is that these were very important. And imagine 1917, Lenin is, he is essentially the most iconic leader of the world, the Bolshevik Revolution. And to kind of capture Lenin, or let's say to, for the lack of a better word, to appropriate Lenin in a very poetic way is his genius. This is something that nobody else has done. People are primarily interested in very immediate, very, very reduced kind of trivial themes. But Iqbal's poetic genius is his canvas, that he would just not leave any theme untouched. Nothing is beyond his literary poetic gaze. So, in that sense, and of course, several of his writings in relation to peasants, workers, poor, marginalized, which is why a lot of people thought that Iqbal was a communist. And then Iqbal had to kind of, in public, he had to kind of defend his Islamic credentials and his principled distance from communism as a philosophy, as an ideology. Who
Um,
positions just one more thing. His idea of faqir. Again, I think I am not really someone who's well versed with Arabic, but my understanding of faqr is also to do with a certain element of ghina, which is, a degree of autonomy, a certain kind of, uh, let's say, a very different element of trust that the faqir has. So, faqir is not really someone who, if you go by the conventional logic of faqir, a faqir is someone who has a very different sense of agency. And so, faqr in that sense is to do with a certain kind of an individuality. And Iqbal would also consider himself as a faqir, and not faqir in a typical economic, commonsensical way, but faqir in terms of a certain position vis a vis existence, vis a vis life. So, in that sense, I think he was not really somebody, but as I said, that in poetry, in philosophy, it's one thing, but day to day life is a different ballgame altogether. In day to day life, he was struggling. He had to make the ends meet, and therefore he was writing to everyone possible. And in fact, he went on to the extent that he said that I'm going to write a commentary of the Holy Quran, and I will actually dedicate it to you if you were to provide me a monthly fellowship. That's a very middle class thing. You can't really hold him accountable for this. This is what middle class people usually do when you figure out that it's very difficult to make the ends meet. These are the I wouldn't use the word tricks, but these are the channels you kind of explore. Um, so that's what. So he's definitely, in that sense, he's employing the usage of faqir a certain way. I'll just quickly read Rafiq's question as well. I think that's the last question. He was claiming not to be a poet since he was into community activism. What was other mode or means to reach masses to encourage activism? Any other form of literary work other than poetry? Well, there were, of course, there were people who were out there in public as reformists, as leaders, as representatives, and they had no qualms about it. But I think the dilemma for Iqbal was that on the one hand he didn't have good things to say about politics as an enterprise, as a domain. And at the same time, he was someone who was exceptionally well versed in poetry. It was part of his DNA. He just couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't stop writing poems. It was almost like, you stop breathing. That's the closest you can get in terms of understanding how difficult it must have been for Iqbal if he were to stop writing poems. Uh, and then I think the other thing is that in Islam, if you look at the classical position in the Quran, there is, of course, a position vis-a-vis poets. So how do you also, as a Muslim, how do you kind of justify your position as a poet? So it was no ordinary dilemma. But there were people, his contemporaries, who were kind of bringing about social reform or social engineering through other ways. It's just that Iqbal could not really do any of that. So the only thing that he could do, and do really well, fantastically well, is through his poetry. And I'm sure now that we think of his poetic corpus, there are no two opinions about the fact that the man actually did a fantastic job through his poems, through his reflections. So this is something that one can think about.
um, Unfortunately, we come to end, but if the professor allows me to ask one question, what was his relationship with Muhammad Assad?
So Muhammad Asad, so it is only towards the end of Iqbal's life that there's a meeting with Muhammad Asad. And Iqbal is kind of keen on developing, he has this idea of some sort of a certain kind of a Darul Ulum, where the modern and the traditional, the religious and the secular, the rational and the revealed will come together. And it is in this context that Iqbal was very much keen on roping in Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri. But of course, Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri did not join Iqbal for whatever reasons. I don't know the reasons. But he ended up, so Maududi ended up not really, not replacing Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, but Maududi was someone who was suggested to Iqbal. So Maududi was there. There was a meeting in the 1930s in Pathankot, and that's where Muhammad Asad also meets. So Muhammad Asad is someone who's kind of entering the picture towards the end of Iqbal's life. Iqbal has lost the sheen, and Maududi is recommended. Iqbal wants someone else, but Maududi is recommended because he is a fierce journalist. He is an extraordinary journalist, and he's also very passionate and active. But Iqbal, of course, if you read Iqbal's reflections, Iqbal doesn't have a high opinion of Maududi. He considers Maududi as a typical masjid imam, which is not a good thing to say given how Jamaat-e-Islami looks at Maulana Maududi. But of course, maybe Maududi was too young at that point of time. So this is something that I would say. So Muhammad Asad enters when Iqbal is thinking about this fantastic experiment vis-a-vis Muslim education and how a new kind of Darul Uloom could. I'm actually forgetting the name. There's actually a name that Iqbal has in mind, and there's a property that was also allocated, that was identified, marked, and Iqbal was very much keen on bringing about the center where the two civilizations, two knowledge traditions could meet and complement each other. But of course, that doesn't happen because Iqbal fell ill, and then there are other things uh, that happen. Yes, thank you, Gohar. Fatima binti Abdullah. That's the thank.
Unfortunately, we came to end of the program. I'll take this opportunity to thank Professor Irfanullah Farooqi for his time.
Thank you, everyone, for your kind attention and your.
Barakallah. Thank you, everyone.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa
Assalamu alaikum wa
rahmatullah.
rahmatullah.